Our speaker tonight is David Rahahę Webb. He's an educator, historian, and environmental scientist and has led several nonprofits spanning more than 2 decades. He's currently the executive director of Muddy Sneakers Outdoor Classroom, an environmental education organization serving students across North Carolina. David belongs to the Tuscarora Nation of North Carolina. He serves as a culture keeper and historian for his community and others. He's also a traditional and contemporary Native American artist, working in sculpture, beadwork, and other mediums that have been featured in museum exhibits and permanent collections throughout the eastern United States. He is a direct descendant of the Spanish Seminoles living at the Sanibel Island Rancho. His family included the first documented births on the island and in southern Florida, and this history is something we're going to hear about tonight. So I just want to say thank you for being here, David, and I'll stop sharing and let you take it away.
All right, thanks, Jamie, and thanks everybody for joining the talk tonight. I'm going to share my screen, make sure I have that all set before I start. All right, so you should see the presentation now.
Yep.
Great, thank you. All right, so as Jamie said, I'm a member of the Tuscarora Nation of North Carolina. I also am a descendant of the Spanish Seminole. A lot of people ask how that's possible. It's kind of like most Americans who might say they have a grandfather who's English and a grandmother who's Scottish and another grandfather who's Italian, and another grandmother who's German. So in the same way, I have different nationalities in my background, including different Native American tribes. I'm an enrolled member of the Tuscarora Nation of North Carolina. I'll introduce myself quickly in my language before I begin. Chwant Nagayas Twaskana, David Gyalset, Uchat Rahahę di Oksanahe Wawe, Skarure di Wagasnuk Disne Squarine Gisasat de Disne Raleigh Waknene. So I introduce myself again in the language. My name is David. My name in the Tuscarora language is Rahahę. He makes the path. I am a member of the Tuscarora Nation of North Carolina and a member of the Wolf Clan, and I currently live in Raleigh. That's what I shared in my language. So tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about the Spanish Seminole. My grandfather's family is descended from the Spanish Indians or Spanish Seminole who lived on Sanibel Island as well as Tampa Bay. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And I'll try to focus a little bit more on the Tampa Bay portion of our history, just because it pertains a little better to this group. And I grew up on Sanibel Island. I'm ninth generation as far as what's documented on the island. So my family goes back there, we say forever. And my ancestors who were first documented on the island were among Seminole children who were brought to Cuba for baptism. So I'll share a little bit about that as we go forward. I also grew up with a family of fishermen. Here's some images of some of my family members, my father, nephew, niece, aunties, and cousins. This is in front of the Tuscarora Nation of North Carolina Longhouse. And also I'm an environmental scientist. Largely, most of my work has been in marine science. So at one point, I ran all the sea turtle conservation for Miami-Dade County, and I worked all up and down the Southwest Florida coast. So going back to Sanibel, my family has very deep roots there. These are some of my grandparents, great-grandparents. We have here my grandmother and Esperanza Woodring, who is a really well-known woman descended from an early pioneer family. Her family came from the Canary Islands, and they actually are credited with being one of the early families, but they arrived after our families were removed. And I'll talk about that a little bit as my direct ancestors were actually imprisoned at Fort Brooke for a period. Here we have my great-granddad Jake Stokes and my great-grandmother Dolly Godwin, and her mother was a Montes de Oca, which is the family the family line of mine that was first documented on Sanibel. So a number of family members here from the Montes de Oca family, including direct ancestors of mine, fishing in the bays. This photo is not of a family member, but I wanted to share it because it fits with the lifestyle that they lived. So for generations, my family lived off of the waters. And at the end of my book, hopefully some of you have had the chance to read it. If you haven't yet, I hope you'll pick it up. But at the end of the book, I have an oral history interview with my grandfather, who shares how they lived on the island, how they subsisted on fish and fishing, um, paddling around in boats very similar to this around the backwaters and bays. So for my methodologies in this research, there's a lot of research shared in this book that has never been shared before. That includes traditional research methodologies. All of the sources are cited accordingly, and also indigenous research methodologies. So there are some stories and oral histories from Seminole and Miccosukee friends that were shared with me that have not been shared before outside of the community. I shared them with permission, which is the right way to go about things from an indigenous methodology standpoint. And the reason why we like to use indigenous methodologies, this includes oral history, this includes indigenous voices and perspectives. It's about decolonizing what we understand about history. History, like our lands and people, is colonized, and history was written by colonizers, and so it's nice to share other perspectives in that as we dig into our histories, our shared histories. So the Spanish Seminole, commonly known as the Spanish Indians, some of you may have heard of Spanish Indians who lived on fishing ranchos in Tampa Bay, down through Sarasota area, Punta Gorda, into Charlotte Harbor, Pine Island Sound, the area around Sanibel Island, and down into what's now Fort Myers Beach and the Everglades. So these fisheries developed along the coasts. They were not made up of primarily Cuban fishermen, as history tells us. My research found that statistically, Cubans were a very small minority. They were actually Seminole people, by and large, who partnered with, collaborated with, and intermarried with Hispanic-Latino fishermen. They were based out of Regla, Cuba, or Regla, Cuba, which is probably the source of confusion. Regla was a port city and very thriving port city in Havana Bay. Um, and we know that the people of these ranchos self-identified as Seminole. That includes my own family. My grandfather identifies as a Seminole descendant through the ranchos and the Spanish Seminoles, and also in some of those baptism records, they're identified as being Seminole in those records from Cuba. So they were a mixture of Miccosukee, Yatkidishi, in the Miccosukee language, and Istijati, Creek-speaking Muskogee people from a little further north. Miccosukee people have always been in Florida, what's now Florida. We have to remember that the border of Florida is relatively recent, and it's a colonial border. So when people like to say that the modern day Seminoles and Miccosukees were not original Florida people, that is completely false. The Miccosukees did always live in the Panhandle, and the Creeks as well. Their territory came down into what's now present day Florida, and both of those nations had hunting grounds throughout the state that they would frequent. So they merged with Florida tribes. The story that I share in my book is about the Tacoshatle clan. This is a clan primarily within the Miccosukee people. And the oral history that I shared from Jimmy Osceola is that when the ancestors of the Miccosukee were permanently settling along the southwest Florida coast, they encountered people whose language they couldn't understand. And it was a community of people who were remnants of the original people of the region. So they were likely Calusa. And when they spoke, it sounded to them like taco, taco, taco is what the oral history says. So they couldn't understand each other very well, but they were able to, through signs and other means, find a way to communicate. They asked if they could join with the Miccosukee, and the Miccosukee convened a council and returned and told them yes, they could join. And they were given their own clan, and that clan survives to this day. It's the Tacoshatle clan, which means taco people. essentially. Um, and that is where most of the Miccosukee clans are related to animals or elements like wind. This is a clan that's very different, that's descended from people who were adopted. So something I like to share is our timeline. We believe as Indigenous people that we have been here for time immemorial, and the settler mindset. Um, it's easy for those of us who have ancestors from Europe or other places to trace back to sort of a first generation and say that, maybe your family arrived prior to the Revolutionary War and you had ancestors who fought in that war, and you can trace back to perhaps maybe 7 generations on the continent. However, when we look at Indigenous people, our time here really truly is immemorial, and you cannot apply the same context to Indigenous people on the land. So, no offense to archaeologists, but archaeologists like to place a time frame on things, and we find that as a colonial construct. So, to say that our people have been here for 14,000 years is a relatively conservative estimate based on more recent archaeological finds and DNA evidence, linguistic studies. We know that our people have been here much longer. But if we look at a 24-hour clock, so this clock that you're looking at is not a 12-hour clock, it's 24 hours. And if we look at that as indigenous presence on the land, starting at 12 a.m., essentially, zero, and going around a full 24 hours, we have the
We have
Calusa
the closest.
fishing culture appearing at about uh, 1:43 p.m. or 13:42 hours. And then the Spanish arrival happens at after 11 p.m. So we're looking at within the last hour of a 24-hour day that Europeans have been on this continent. The U.S. took possession perhaps around 11:40 p.m. based on this time scale. And so that means that we have at least 1.5 million generations of our people on North America, what we call Turtle Island, and at least 42,000 generations in present day Florida, based on sort of current understandings. So we're all probably familiar with the history of Florida, that it changed hands from being claimed by Spain to being claimed by Britain, back to Spain, and then becoming U.S. territory. So Hispanic-Latino fishermen began working with the Calusa themselves um, in the early 1500s and into the 1600s. The for throughout most of the 1500s, the Calusa resisted the Spanish, and they actually are credited with killing Juan Ponce de Leon after his 1513 arrival. And these Hispanic Latino fishermen had seasonal operations along the coast, and based out, as I said, out of Cuba. And what they did was they learned the fishing practices of the Calusa, and the Calusa's ancestors and those fishing practices go back about 6,000 years on the land. So essentially, the Spanish Indians and Spanish Seminole, who are descended from these communities along the Gulf Coast, um, are a continuation of that 6,000-year-old fishing culture. So the Calusa largely resisted colonization and Catholicism. And by about 1760, the Calusa political body had fallen. A lot of this research comes comes from John Worth. I'm sure many of you are familiar with his research, but they essentially evacuated to Havana around that time. And remnants, however, were incorporated into the Seminole. And that is widely understood among the Seminole and Miccosukee people. That oral history that I shared a little bit ago is one example, but there are probably many more examples. Whenever people say that a people are extinct, I like to think that they're just thinking about their political structure. being extinct or a political entity being extinct, where people always survive, and whether they're incorporated into other people or form remnant communities, they end up surviving. And so the Calusa were not completely removed from the land, neither were most of the other Florida tribes. Um, then we have a period of Spanish missions across Florida, spanning from St. Augustine on the east coast to Pensacola. And here is a photo that I took in Cuba. This is from El Morro. This is the fort across Havana Bay from the city of Havana, as you can see. And the reason I have this is just to kind of share perspective. If you were to turn to the right and face north, you're facing Florida. And Florida at the time was really like hinterlands as far as the Spanish were concerned. It was kind of like Cuba North. There really wasn't much going on in Florida besides the missions that were established. And so Havana really served as sort of a gateway to the Spanish colonies throughout Latin America. It was a very strategic location for the Spanish. So we see here that the fishermen working with the Calusa. Then we see that migration down. So this map shows this sort of movement of Seminole people down into the peninsula in permanent settlements where, they would often hunt and fish throughout the area. These were more permanent camps being established and towns, entire towns relocating. So I talk about some of those towns that moved and established on old town sites from Appalachia, for instance, present day Tallahassee. The Creek settled around Tampa Bay, and down in Southwest Florida, we have the Miccosukee primarily settled. And then, of course, the British period, the British captured, moving my cat here out of the way, the British captured Havana and used that as leverage to take possession of Florida. Then we ended up having the Second Spanish period and the Seminole War. So as even prior to the U.S. taking possession, many of you may know that Andrew Jackson launched invasion campaigns into Florida. Spain did not have the funds to defend Florida, nor the army present to defend Florida. Their allies were unarmed. There's a lot of history about that I share in the book, and how that ended up really, really badly for the allies like the Appalachia of the Spanish. And essentially, what the Americans consider to be the Seminole Wars is really just one long resistance that was resistance to colonization. So this map shows a number of the towns that were recorded in the baptisms that I mentioned. So this is how they were written in those baptisms. Present day places are known by different names. For instance, Tio Cespas down in Charlotte Harbor is actually Usepa Island today. The name was changed over time. And you can see a number of camps that were established around Tampa Bay on this map, as well as these towns up here. And there's a general migration. And even in the baptism records, we see towns listed up here in the Panhandle. My own family was first listed up in Choconicla, and they moved down to Sanibel Island, and that was really the trend. And here are the ranchos in Southwest Florida. So some statistics that come out of those baptism records, as well as other records, show that the vast majority of the 600 Spanish Seminole that were identified as the overall population by American surveyors was the majority were not documented by name, and only about 20% of the population could be identified. So only 18 individuals or 3% of people are found in the U.S. Census records. So after the United States took over and Monroe County actually extended all the way up the Southwest Florida coast, you could look back in those census records and find very few Hispanic-Latino names that could be attributed to these ranchos. And then we see the economic significance. So some of you may be familiar with the fur trade, the beaver skin trade, the beaver wars. the deerskin trade in the southeast. This was really important for the indigenous populations along the edges of English settlements. So it brought goods from England in exchange for commodities like the furs that they would trade, and that really changed the entire economy of the people of that area. In the same way, this fishing trade from Southwest Florida and Tampa Bay um, really changed the economy of the people who would become the Seminole people. So we have at least 800,000 pounds recorded of fish being sent down to Cuba annually from Southwest Florida waters. And at the time, in the early 1800s, their value was at about $18,000 per year, which was quite a bit. So we were seeing guns and ammunition, powder, um, pots, pans, all sorts of goods from the Spanish being traded via the fisheries. So we also know from those baptism records that their identities remained centered around their indigenous roots. So these Miccosukee and Creek-speaking people continued to speak their languages. The baptism records tell us that my own ancestor, Juan Montes de Oca, was a translator. His brother Gregorio was also a translator, and his sister. And they're featured on some of these records as providing translation services for the children and their families and the priests. And they remained fluid with the mainland Seminoles, so they were constantly moving back and forth. Not only was there commerce, but it's documented that the people were going back and forth constantly. Uh, all of these baptism records focus on the importance of the mother in making decisions for the children. And we also see that various activities continued, such as dances that I'll talk about in a moment. So we're going to get into some of the baptism records. This is a view of El Morro from the water in the bay, and you can see a schooner, which is the type of boat that carried people from back and forth from the ranchos to Cuba and perhaps elsewhere. So that first baptism record I showed you is one of my family members. We'll go into another one in a moment. The church that they went to was this spot here in Regla. You can see on the map, it's right at the back of the bay here, Regla. And the church is Nuestra Señora de la Regla. And that is the emanation of the Virgin Mary that's featured in this church. And you'll notice that she is a black or brown woman. And this is what it looks like inside the church. I've actually visited there in my studies and research. And essentially today, this is a sacred site for practitioners of Santeria. They see that virgin, as Yemaya, one of their goddesses or orishas. And here we have a record of Benito Montes de Oca. He would be one of my ancestors' first cousins. He was born in the town of Choconicla near Appalachia, and they're likely referring to the province of Appalachia here. Gregorio was the brother of my ancestor Juan, and Gregorio's wife, who was from Choconicla, was named Rita Magauga. So, and that name I've tried to find a meaning for it from friends of mine who speak the Miccosukee and Creek Seminole languages, and they've been unable to help me with that. We also have Rita de Los Angeles, Montes de Oca, and she was born on Sanibel Island. So you see the movement, the family moved down from Choconicla that you see here down at the bottom. And some of those statistics from those baptisms, of the 42 parents included in the records, all of the mothers and 5 of the fathers were identified as Indian. 16 of the fathers were Latino, and several were Native or Mestizo. All of the mothers were Native from the local Native population. There were no Hispanic-Latino women brought up from Cuba. Four of the fathers were Campechanos, which they were actually Maya people who were forcefully relocated from the Yucatan to Cuba after a Maya uprising. And so we have four of those fathers recorded as Campechanos. Three of the fathers were Spanish, and my family was the sole Cuban family in these baptism records. Six children had no father listed, and remember, being matrilineal and matriarchal, it really was not important in indigenous communities necessarily who the father was. Oftentimes, the mother's brother was the most important male figure in a child's life. And 16 of the 30 children um, had a surname, and nearly half of them said their first name with Indian afterward. Here's some of the records shared in the book. The towns that are featured in those baptisms, we see all up and down the coast, even a reference in here to Tampa, town of Tampa, which is interesting. So there was obviously a Seminole town there prior to Tampa being founded. And then here's a family tree of my family that belonged to the ranchos. Some parentage is uncertain, so I have some question marks. Some researchers have tried to attribute different family members as ancestors, and honestly, they do not match up. So there's a section in the book dedicated directly to those researchers that refutes really any claim that anybody has made on the parentage of Juan, my ancestor, and his brother Gregorio and Marcelina. Gregorio may have been Juan's father. He's actually young enough to be Gregorio's son, and it would fit essentially the family tree if perhaps he was his son. And Juan had two wives. I believe the first wife was removed. He had a set of children with her. Victoria Montes de Oca married one of the early mayors of Tampa, Alfonso Delaney. And Victoria was noted as being this beautiful Seminole woman by all accounts in the books. There are a couple of books that I cite as sources about Tampa in particular. And we had other family members here who were found in Fort Brooke later on after they're essentially rounded up. Dominga Montes de Oca, we're not sure who her parents were. Gregorio could have been her father. Juan was too young to be her father, but they were obviously related. But Dominga actually married Maximo Hernandez, and they lived at what's now Maximo Point, where the Sunshine Skyway bridge lands on a mound. And there's a great story that I share in my book about a hurricane relevant to recent history of Tampa, but a really big hurricane that came through and flooded, and they took refuge on the mound during that hurricane. Other Montes de Oca family members recorded as Indian in various American census records as far south as Key West. Here we have a story about the Sanibel Rancho. There was a American surveyor by the name of Dr. Strobel. He came down to assess the land for American settlement. They wanted to build a subdivision on Sanibel Island in the early 1800s. And he came and stayed in the Spanish Seminole community there on the island where my family was living at the time and documented dances that they did that are identical to dances that the Seminoles still do and actually dances that we do in my own community. The particular dance he describes is a stomp dance where the women wear these turtle shell shakers on their legs. He described how the dance took place and essentially how they would kick their feet when the song commenced and the sound being very loud. Here's a video I'd like to share quickly, and hopefully the sound will work for it. But we have a dance among our people called the alligator dance, and our oral history for this dance says that it came from the Seminoles. That the version of the oral history that has been conveyed to me is that some of our people went down and assisted the Seminole during their resistance or the Seminole Wars. And in exchange, one of the things that they gave us was this dance. And it's always a nice story, that you hear growing up, but I just figured it was an old story until I came across a recording of Josie Billy from the mid 20th century where he was singing the exact same songs. And this is a recording in the Smithsonian collections, but the songs were identical to the songs that we sing. And we do this dance quite often. That's me leading in the front in my community at one of our annual powwows and relatives behind. So that's one example of how that culture lives on, not only among just Seminole people, but even among other tribes. So now getting into what happened in the ranchos, why the Spanish Seminole ended up leaving. By 1836, the removals were well underway, and Seminole people were being rounded up. Many of them surrendered, signing treaties at the Treaty of Moultrie Creek, for instance, where a number of leaders who were also not entitled to sign on behalf of all their people because that's essentially not how indigenous societies were made up. They didn't have one leader who could speak on behalf of everyone, typically, especially in the East. So this was rejected by a large contingent of the Seminoles who resisted because they were not party to those agreements and would have refused to sign. So the removals were underway in 1836, and Seminoles were being loaded up on boats from Tampa Bay and sent across the Gulf to New Orleans and up the river, eventually ending up in Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. And originally they were put on a shared reservation with the Creeks, and later the Seminole were given their own reservation. There was an American officer stationed on Yusepa Island, and he was there because the Americans were really curious about how much commerce was taking place with Cuba. They wanted to see duties being paid. Oftentimes, as the boats would pass by Key West, they would stop at a way station there and pay their duties or taxes on imports, exports. They were all checked at that station, and they were concerned that there were things that were slipping by that were not being accounted for or paid, and they were also really concerned about arms being smuggled in to assist the Seminole. So U.S. naval vessels were sent down one day to Charlotte Harbor, and just as they were arriving, there was a contingent of Seminoles who attacked the island rancho, and they likely attacked this island because of that American station there. Any Seminole person who worked with the Americans was deemed a traitor, and they also were subject to death as the penalty for working with Americans. So he attacked this rancho. Henry Cruz, the officer, had been harassing the Spanish Seminole living here and the Hispanic Latino men for some time. He had even been disciplined uh, for harassing them and causing a lot of problems for them. But what happened was these boats, these naval vessels, were entering the bay as a number of canoes were trying to exit the bay at Boca Grande or Boca Grande, heading out towards the Gulf to get away from their burning chicky huts that were attacked. They were picked up, and the naval officers pursued the Seminole war party down across the islands, across Sanibel, down to the mainland, and I believe they lost them as they hit out in the Everglades. So now we get to the removal. So all of those people piled onto those boats and were brought to Fort Brooke. They then ended up working and living on the Mullet Keys largely. Some were there at the Maximo Point Rancho. Some were at Spanish Town Creek, which is present-day Hyde Park. I know some of my family were at the Mullet Keys, and some were also associated with Spanish Town Creek. On this next map, You can see friendly Indians indicated here at Spanish Town Creek. My ancestor Juan and his brother Gregorio were the executors of the will of the Hispanic man who owned this land first. He was the first official owner of this land in the European context of land ownership and deed holding. And when he passed away, he made Juan and Gregorio the executors of his will. So at one point, my direct ancestor was managing this land that's now Hyde Park. And we ended up having one day when all the people were out, when all the men were out fishing, the women and children were rounded up. And that happened because General Thomas Jessup was adamant that the Spanish Seminole needed to be removed along with the other Seminole. He asserted that they were supplying arms to the resistance, which was likely true. He said that they were subject to the treaties that were made, even if they were not part of those treaties or present, they were still subject to them, and they had been in violation of those treaties because they were not living on the designated reservation. So the Spanish Seminole had never lived on the reservation, according to themselves, and were not present and part of those agreements. And so they really tried to distinguish themselves, as we'll see. He wanted all of the Indian men and their families rounded up, whether at the rancho on the coast or at the treaty holders or not. And that includes all the Indians and children who the chiefs may demand. And Holate Amafla, one of the chiefs, who worked with the Americans and voluntarily removed his community, claimed that the Spanish Seminole belonged to his people. So essentially, one day the men were out fishing, and the army came into the ranchos and rounded up all the women and children, including my own family. They imprisoned them at Fort Brooke. They were detained there for some time. There was one account of these removals where 150 to 160 people from Charlotte Harbor were transported up through New Orleans, and this article in the Arkansas Gazette explained that they were the most dirty and squalid group that they had seen. They had been hunted out of the fastness of their native country like wild animals and had been herded aboard boats with no opportunity to secure and bring with them their meager personal belongings. So essentially, the conditions that they endured on these boats were pretty abysmal. So my own ancestors and other Spanish Seminole men who were part of those baptisms filed a petition, and this petition was filed by two white men on their behalf. I don't know if any of them could read or write in English. So there were two white men that filed it, two Americans that filed it on their behalf. It was 21 Spanish Seminole men and their families listed by name. And they claimed that they were Seminole, but they were not part of the resistance. They'd never lived on the reservation. They said they would remain at Fort Brooke until all the Seminole were removed, the other Seminole were removed. They said they'd lived in Florida before it was the United States, and according to the Adams-Onis Treaty, they should be able to keep their lands there, their homesteads and the ranchos. And they said it was a long established custom to marry Seminole women, and that the Spanish government recognized these marriages, which is interesting because there were no churches in the ranchos, no sign of Catholicism in the ranchos, no priests in the ranchos, yet their marriages were considered to be legitimate, and their children were baptized legitimately. So they pledged allegiance to the United States, and my own ancestor being among them, he ended up serving as a translator for the army for the rest of his life. And they lived at Fort Brooke for some time, I'm guessing, as per that petition, until the remainder of the Seminole were removed or no longer seen as a threat. And so they're listed on the census records for Fort Brooke for several years. His first wife, as I said, was probably removed. His second wife, my ancestor Mary, she was documented as Mary Johns, and the Johns last name is a last name found on the Seminole Reservation at Brighton, just kind of inland above Lake Okeechobee. And they were together at Fort Brooke for some time. They had at least four children. The children were born prior to that petition, so we know they were together before then in the ranchos. And he worked for the Army for at least 36 years. So he was known to be better acquainted and closer to the Seminole people than any other man in the state. He worked from Withlacoochee down to Big Cypress. He would sometimes partner with other Seminoles who knew the lands, especially even down in the 10,000 Islands. Juan wasn't necessarily familiar with all those islands, but he would partner with someone like Polly Bermudez, who, excuse me, had been also captured by the Army, and her husband was a chief that the Army documented as Chachi. He ended up actually taking his own life, and Polly was a widow and remarried another Spanish Seminole. And she didn't speak English, so Juan would translate to English from her language, which was probably Creek, but Juan also translated the Miccosukee language. So Juan's children, including my ancestor Manuel, served in the Civil War, of course, on the Confederate side. They enlisted after Tampa was attacked by the Union, and I think they felt, compelled to protect their town as they saw it, and so they joined in a company of Indians and Spaniards. Then Manuel, who was known as Canoe, and his brother moved to Lake Kissimmee, and they started cattle ranches. So here's a photo actually of one of my grandfather's cousins who started the Seminole tribe of Florida's cattle program. His name was Fred Montes de Oca, or Fred Montes de Oca. And he also oversaw the first election of the Seminole government. And Juan's children continued to be closely associated with other Seminole people for generations. So we know what happened to them. We know that most were forcibly removed to Oklahoma. A number escaped those removals and ended up among the Seminole and Miccosukee people and the independent Seminole communities. Those are communities who never came in under the federally recognized government of the Seminole and continue to just be sovereign individuals in the Everglades. And then, of course, my own family. I also recently heard from one of my Montes de Oca's cousins that the Hernandez family is still in the Tampa Bay area, descendants of Maximo. So hopefully we're going to have a family reunion soon and reconnect with some of these other descendants. And then right before we get into Q&A, if you are interested in picking up a copy of my book, I recommend that you go to the Florida Historical Society Press and actually get it from their store. If you try to order it on Amazon, they are always on back order, so it could be several months before you see it. And of course, the Florida Historical Society is a nonprofit and a good cause to support. So at this point, I think we can go ahead and open it up to questions.
Thank you, David, for the excellent talk and sharing your histories with us. Yeah, let's open it up for questions. Feel free to either type it in the chat, or if you're on mute and want to ask it, go for it. Either way.
So, Jamie, are most of the participants from the Archaeological Society members?
Looks like most of the attendees are members.
Great.
We oftentimes get a good mix of people who aren't members, but see the event on Facebook or something and find it interesting.
Yeah,
A lot of these
yeah,
names seem familiar.
yeah. Thanks, Robert. I see your question. Yeah, I used an app to restore the photos. Most of them were too poor of quality to print in the book, so I had to use that app to restore them. Can you tell us more about what you've learned about the Hernandez family? So I don't have a whole lot of information about the Hernandez family. There's some information in the book related to Dominga Montes de Oca, who married Maximo. And apparently she sold that land after Maximo passed away to two different people. And one was a man from Quebec, which is why I think it's called Frenchman's Creek or something right there in the area, which is named for him. He took over ownership after she sold the property. And Dominga disappeared. So I'm not sure if she went maybe to Cuba or another Spanish-speaking colony or country. Um, but nobody really knows what happened to her after she sold the property to two different people. Um, More about family structures. Moms are important to the head of the family. So, in most Eastern indigenous cultures, they are matrilineal. So we get our clans, which is sort of a larger family that we belong to, through our mothers. So, for instance, I belong to the Wolf clan of the Tuscarora Nation, and I am descended through my mother. And you get your mother, your clan from your mother, and they get it from her. She gets it from her mother, and so forth. Um, uh, the way inheritance would work in terms of leadership positions, for example, it would typically go to the it would go from one man to his nephew. So if his sister had a son, he would be the one to inherit something like a chief title, and that was common, actually going back to Mississippian culture. That we have the example among the Natchez or the Nachi uh, of how that descendancy worked, and we see it throughout tribes all throughout the eastern U.S. to the present day. So among Seminole Creek people, they have a Miko title, and those are also handed down that way. Good questions. Who is in charge of governance in the community? So often there were councils, various councils. So there could be a peace council, there could be a war council, there could be an elders council. There were sometimes women's councils, um, and so in Seminole communities, I talk about that a little bit in the beginning of the book. That they were the different councils had different roles and couldn't overstep from one role to the other. Let's see. Clear gender roles. Yes, yes, correct. And there was in Florida a very well documented third gender role in Florida that fell between those two gender roles. And that also existed in tribes up and down the East Coast. Um, thank you. Wondering if you think there are additional insights that archaeology could provide. Absolutely. I know there are discoveries made all the time of artifacts that are found from the period of the ranchos. So you have them sometimes living on top of mounds that could be thousands of years old, and those artifacts are going to be closer to the surface, as most of you would know. But I think there's a lot to be learned from how they subsisted, what they ate, maybe trade goods that were found in the areas where the ranchos were. I think something that would be really interesting would be any sign of religion, Christian religion in the ranchos. So, by all accounts, there was only one reference to any sort of religious article, and that was a little statue of an angel in one of the huts in the Charlotte Harbor rancho. Um, and there's no reference to, like, large crosses or huts that served as little churches or temples or anything like that. So it would be really interesting if evidence of that was found. I personally don't believe a lot of creolization occurred in the ranchos. Um, I Judging by this and the fact that some of the American surveyors who came in said that um, most of the people spoke the indigenous languages, and that some of these families because there were so few Hispanic Latino people in these communities that they would marry back into the Seminole population, Miccosukee population, and you had some examples of people who were maybe one quarter Hispanic Latino and three quarters indigenous because they kept marrying back in. And so there really isn't a whole lot of evidence of creolization by conventional sense. All right. Any other questions? Thank you. All right. So look like we're all set, Jamie.
Sure, I'll ask you one last question. I
Great.
noticed that you have a new book. Did you want to tell us about
Oh
that?
yeah. Yeah, thank you. I do. I have a new book coming out in the spring. Um, it's published it's published by McFarland and Company, so it'll have a pretty wide reach. But it's called Indigenous Carolinians, from the original people to present day tribes. And what I do in this book is actually explore my own people's history, starting with our creation stories and various language groups, language families, and languages throughout our region here in the Carolinas. I'm originally from Florida, but my father is from here. My father's enrolled with the Meherrin Indian tribe. My mother, my sister, her kids, myself are enrolled with the Tuscarora Nation of North Carolina, as I mentioned. Um, and I write all about our histories and migrations, diasporas, uh, the wars that happened, like the Tuscarora War, for example. A lot of people aren't familiar with that being a very pivotal war for settler colonialism in the Carolinas because we controlled access beyond the coast to the Carolinas, and then getting into the present day and how there are several state recognized tribes, a couple of federally recognized tribes in the region that are largely descended from these same groups and connecting different families specifically. So that'll be out in the spring, and you can actually pre-order it on the McFarland and Company website. All right. And could you elaborate on Maximo versus he in the St. Petersburg area? Yes, he was. He was. So he inhabited Maximo Point, what's now called Maximo Point. There's a place there called Maximo Park, just near the base of the Sunshine Skyway Bridge, and there are the remnants of of the mound there, and it's right on the water, so it's a pretty cool little park. And I partner up sometimes with a professor who teaches at UCF, and he leads canoe trips through there. And uh, it might be neat to I can send you his info, Jamie, and see if that's something that might interest the group.
Yeah,
Would you ever
definitely.
consider writing an historic fiction? I've thought about it. I've never written fiction before. I'm a scientist. I think that would be interesting for me to try. But yeah, I've really thought about it. I actually started sort of a plot storyline about these individuals because when I was writing this and researching them, it was like they really kind of came to life for me, reading their stories and just also knowing my own family oral histories. We have a number of stories about these men that I assume are Juan and Gregorio. They're not named by name, but we have stories about them in our family. Um, so yeah, absolutely. And I have a really cool old book that uh, has been handed down to me that has a lot of old photos. That's where a lot of these photos came from, and they were just really, really poor quality. Um, and and these stories that were told and oral histories that were recorded. So yeah, I would love to do that. All right. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kathy. Thank you, Jamie, and thank you everybody for listening tonight.
Absolutely. Thanks, David. And I'll be in touch. Be sure to order the book or both books. Thanks, David.
Thank you.